What are you waiting for? Take him out!
I can't.
If someone deletes a deleter, how many deleters are left in the room? I remember this was a big discussion in relation to the deleting penalty, but we'll get back to that. In the beginning of Avatar: The Last Airbender, episode 1, The Boy in the Iceberg, we see that Aang is able to go into the Avatar state. In episode 3, The Southern Air Temple, we see him go into the Avatar state again. He is angry because he sees that the Fire Nation had destroyed his home and his friends. And in episode 12, The Storm, not only do we learn that the Avatar state is activated by emergency, but also that he can waterbend in the Avatar state, something he has not learned to do himself in his natural state, which left us with more questions than answers. Because if he can already bend all the elements in the Avatar state, why does he have to go on a hunt to find masters who are going to teach him these same elements? So much so that the books are named after whatever element Aang is mastering at that point. So if he was already capable of this, what was the point of learning this? For all those who are playing this as background noise and have no idea what I'm talking about, the avatar state is where the current avatar can tap into the strengths and capabilities of all the avatars that came before him, and then uses these larger than life powers in battle. It is not only cool, it looks super cool too. As much as this is incredible, I believe there is an anticlimactic reason as to why our first encounter with Aang is him in the avatar state. It is to show that the avatar state, while it may be a cool addition to the arsenal, it is not the most epic part of this journey, and it is not how it is supposed to end. So, did how it's supposed to end have anything to do with him hunting for his masters and learning the elements by himself naturally? Yes, but not in the way that you think. I think skill-wise or technically, what makes the most sense is that the avatar state is like a library. Everyone has to learn so that they add to the library of skills, tricks, and tips, making an epic collection. That way, the avatar state gets stronger with every generation. If all avatars just relied on the avatar state, it would be the equivalent of only having one book and then copying and pasting every single time, which would make the avatar state very unremarkable. So it would just be the skills of the first avatar, which would be quite underwhelming. So learning in that regard is useful. But Aang does not have the luxury of time to master all 4 elements. So why does he have to learn? Because even when he does learn, he doesn't become an expert at them. He's simply good. So was mediocrity the goal? Not at all. The learning was important not because of the bending itself. If you observe, more attention was drawn to the character of the masters and what they represented or believed and how that influenced their bending rather than their bending itself being the focus. Why? Because the point of the entire series is Aang's character development. A whole series beautifully written around the idea of character development, entirely for character development's sake. Every avatar before Aang had the luxury of knowing that they were going to be the avatar at the age of 16. So in their mid to late teens, they had already had somewhat of a normal childhood. After that, they had years to master the elements and to gain wisdom before they were expected to maintain or bring balance to the world. So it was not even usually in a time of war that they had to operate as avatar. Aang did not have the same privilege. He was only 12 when he had to be told that he was avatar because there was a war coming. He was still so young. This was a huge weight of responsibility that was placed on him, which made him feel isolated and anxious. And his friends starting to treat him differently did not help the situation, especially at an age where their approval means everything. One night, he overheard the monks talking about sending him away to train. This would separate him from Monk Yatso, who was not only his mentor but also his father figure. Feeling scared, confused, and like he was losing the people he loved, he panicked and he fled on Appa. That's when the storm hit, causing him to fall into the ocean and enter the avatar state, freezing himself and Appa in the iceberg for 100 years. And when he unfroze and found what was done, not only was he suffering from denial and imposter syndrome, now he also had a strong sense of guilt for not being there to protect the people that he loved. As Aang is navigating all these feelings and also being avatar all the way through to the final battle, battle. We see him interact with past avatars quite often to get advice. An important detail is they use their lived experience quite often in order to provide guidance. Why is that important? Because it helps us understand why the avatar state is not actually a plot hole. Aang's situation was quite unique, and for every avatar coming after him, it would be a wealth of experience to pull from. So if the avatar state is a library, the plot had little to do with what he could do with the avatar state, but what he could add to it. With so many challenges, very few resources, and a limited amount of time. Which is why it was so important that his teachers and his team had to be young. If not physically, then mentally, like Gyatso and Bumi. Not only because he still needed to live out his childhood with his friends, but also because they did not need rigidity. They needed creativity, fluidity, and tons of energy to explore unconventional solutions. Aang's first master is Katara, which is perfect. Having lost his entire community, Aang needed Katara because she is a mother, a protector. She provided stability and guardianship. Technically, from her, he learned healing, flowing movement, adaptability, and fighting the opponent using their own force. But what he really learned was that compassion and persistence are as powerful as strength, which was a great lesson in a time of war. Paco, on the other hand, was more of a technical teacher, and a phenomenal one at that. He taught Aang discipline and eventually a healthy respect for tradition. Toph was a perfect master because she reflected him in some way. Toph was also young and lacking in what seemed necessary, and yet she used her weaknesses to her advantage. She had every reason to pity herself and hide away. Yet when it came to it, she always faced her difficulties head on. He had a lot to learn from her in that this is what Aang needed: to stop running.
Do it now! What? Earthbend, Twinkletoes.
And this was reflected in her bending. Technically, she taught him raw power, rootedness, and direct confrontation. But what he really learned was to stand firm, face your problems head on, and not run away. And that strength isn't just physical, it is about unshakable will. As an air nomad, Aang was taught to avoid conflict. Toph taught him that sometimes you have to stand your ground instead of avoiding conflict. Bumi wasn't actually Aang's teacher, but I believe their interaction together showed him that just because you face your problems head on and you stand on business, it does not mean you lose your childlike wonder. Zhong was Aang's first firebending master, and even though they didn't last, he taught him a very important lesson: that holding back does not mean weakness, and that power without control is destruction. Because he was too excited about firebending and lacked patience, he ended up burning Katara, who he loved. He eventually learned that control is true power. Next, we had Zuko. He was a perfect master because he showed what running on anger could do to you. Zuko was miserable before he had a change of heart and decided to forgive. Zuko had learned the lesson of letting go of anger, and Aang needed this not only because of what had happened to his people, but because now he had to forgive his firebending master, Zuko. Technically, he taught Aang controlled fire, redirection of lightning, and breathwork. But what he truly taught him was that fire can come from life, drive, and purpose, not just anger. Fire is not just rage, but the spark of life and drive to protect. He learned how to use passion as energy without letting it consume him. After all these important lessons, Aang also had to stay true to his roots. Technically, he learns agility, evading, gliding, and using movement instead of brute force. But at the core, from Gyatso, much like Bumi, he learned humor and lightheartedness, even in times of hardship. And from his entire clan, he learned detachment, spirituality, and valuing all life. He learned freedom and peace, to hold on to joy and one's values even in war. That was soon about to be tested. Nearing the end, Aang was more conflicted about how to end the battle with Ozai than if he would win or not. He asked his entire team and they all gave him the same answer. When he channels his past lives, all the avatars give him the same answer too. He even channels Avatar Yang Chen, who was a female air nomad, simply looking for an understanding ear. But she too gives the same conclusion, which was that as Avatar, she believed you had to make some hard decisions, even violent ones, for the greater good. She warns him that the Avatar must put the world's needs before his own beliefs. So basically, they all said, delete him. In the middle of his turmoil, he realizes that he is on the back of a lion turtle, creatures who once granted humans the ability to bend the elements temporarily. They are described as the ancient protectors of mankind. The one Aang meets teaches him energy bending, the one final piece he needed to face Ozai. As the battle begins, we see that the skills that Aang had mastered were only good at best, because with all four elements at his advantage, he was just barely managing to survive. If I was being generous, I would say both Aang and Ozai were holding their own. But in truth, Ozai was leading. It helps us confirm that learning the elements was not the point of his training. In the heat of battle, Aang's avatar state is activated. And you can fight me on this, but to me, this was the most epic looking scene of the entire series. He turns into the symbol of balance, showing that he is now a fully activated or fully realized avatar, one who can completely control his avatar state. And after this point, it's no longer a fight, okay? It is a hunt after Ozai. It looks epic. After a fierce pursuit, Aang is about to unleash his final blow with all four elements. But suddenly he stops. The elements weakly fall to the ground and Aang gets out of his avatar state, knowing fully well that this ending was not going to be right. Then we are left to wonder, was that build-up pointless? Not at all. It was intentional. Because even though we are led to believe that the defeat of Fire Lord Ozai is the point of the story, in reality it is far from that. If you noticed, most leaders and every avatar that Aang interacted with referred to him as young avatar. They saw him as a child, simply a tool to fulfill destiny through. He had no real identity in their eyes. If he didn't come back to himself and instead deleted Ozai, he would forever be known as young avatar, being guided by the rest. Aang was so loving and loved, and that is why he was so kind and merciful and trusting. On the other hand, Ozai was not. He was merciless and evil. He banished his own son, agreed to kill his own father, dethroned his brother. So Aang deleting him would have been the deleter's dilemma we talked about in the beginning. Should he become Ozai in order to defeat Ozai? In my opinion, that would mean Ozai still won. The entire series up until this point was about seeing Aang learn to make decisions and eventually overcome imposter syndrome. That's why his final move was so epic. He restrains Ozai's limbs with earth and then touches his forehead, proceeding to bend out the fire-bending energy from Ozai and symbolically not being consumed by Ozai's energy. That for Ozai was the ultimate defeat, worse than death. And that, my friends, was the point of the entire series, the conclusion of his character development. He added a completely new perspective to the Avatar library because he used all his learned lessons but also stayed true to himself. Despite opposition, he became his own person, a valid Avatar, and I don't know if we will ever see such phenomenal writing again. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like, comment, share, and subscribe if you want to help me get my grandmother some dentures. I will see you in the next video.